What started with ordinary questions and humor ended with the collapse of the reputation of one of the celebrities. But here's how it started. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the latest stories. The interview began smoothly. Jimmy tossed soft questions about Tom's new film, a heartfelt drama already buzzing in Oscar predictions. Tom answered with poise, his anecdotes polished yet sincere, eliciting laughter from the audience with his signature self-deprecation. But the studio atmosphere was tense, like an electric wire humming with too much current. Cameras panned across the audience, their smiles wide, but their eyes darting, sensing the shift that was coming. Then Jimmy leaned forward, his tone shifting from playful to sharp. "So, Tom," he said, a faint edge creeping into his voice, "people often say you had one truly great film, Forrest Gump, obviously, and the rest just rode its coattails. They call you a genius off one hit. What do you say to that?" The question landed like a grenade. The audience gasped, their collective inhale draining the warmth from the room. Tom's smile froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed the jab. The studio lights seemed to brighten, casting harsh shadows across his face. Behind the cameras, a producer whispered frantically into a headset. "He wasn't supposed to ask that." Tom tilted his head, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Well, Jimmy, I'd say those people haven't been paying attention. I've been fortunate to work on films like Saving Private Ryan, Cast Away, Apollo 13, projects that meant something to people. If they think one film defines me, that's their loss, not mine." His words were measured, but his jaw tightened, and the audience shifted, sensing the undercurrent of irritation. Jimmy laughed, but it was a hollow sound, more challenge than amusement. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his smile widening. "Fair enough, fair enough. But you've got this reputation, right? America's dad, the nice guy. Some say you lean into that role a little too hard. Doesn't it ever get exhausting, playing that part?" The question wasn't in the script. Tom's publicist, standing backstage, froze, her clipboard trembling in her hands. The audience murmured, mixing nervous laughter with unease. Tom's fingers tapped once on the armrest, a subtle but telling gesture. "I don't play a role, Jimmy," he said, his voice low but firm. "I try to be decent. If that's a brand, I'm proud of it. But I'm not here to perform for cynics." The word cynics hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The audience clapped, but the applause was uneven, uncertain, as if they weren't sure whether to cheer or brace for impact. Jimmy's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes flicking to the control booth, where the director was gesturing frantically. But instead of backing off, Jimmy doubled down, his tone growing bolder, almost reckless. "Speaking of cynics," he said, leaning forward again, "you've been caught up in some wild stuff online. People mentioning you in these, let's call them out-there conspiracy theories. QAnon, elites, all that. Why stay silent? Why not fight back and clear your name?" The studio fell silent, a silence so heavy it felt like a scream. The audience froze, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. A camera operator stumbled, nearly missing his mark, as the director hissed into the comms, "Cut to commercial." But the live feed didn't break, the red lights on the cameras unblinking. Tom's face hardened, his gaze locking onto Jimmy's with an intensity that made the host shift in his seat. The wariness in Tom's eyes was gone, replaced by something fiercer, something real. "Jimmy," Tom said, his voice low and deliberate, each word a warning, "I don't owe anyone an explanation for nonsense cooked up in basements. I've spent 40 years building a career on stories that matter, on work that lifts people up. You think I'm going to dignify that garbage with a response?" He leaned forward, his presence filling the stage, his voice rising just enough to carry a quiet fury. "You're asking me to fight shadows when I'd rather shine a light. That's my choice. And frankly, I'm disappointed you'd even bring it up." The audience erupted, a wave of applause mixed with cheers, their energy tilting toward Tom. A woman in the front row stood, clapping fiercely, her face alight with admiration. But Jimmy didn't flinch. His smile returned, sharper now, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. He opened his mouth to speak, his next question already forming, when the director's voice crackled through the comms. "Jimmy, stop. Now." But the host ignored it, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous mix of ambition and defiance. The tension in the studio was suffocating, like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Tom sat back, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze never leaving Jimmy's. The audience held its breath, sensing the precipice. Whatever came next would change everything. Jimmy, ignoring the panic in the control booth and the producer's whispers in his earpiece, leaned forward. His voice was syrupy but laced with venom. "All right, Tom, let's go deeper. You know there's a whole community online calling you part of this so-called Hollywood conspiracy? QAnon, elites, all these wild stories. How do you live with that? Doesn't it weigh on you?" The question struck like lightning. The room gasped, the sound so loud it drowned out the crackle of the director's headset screaming, "Jimmy, stop, damn it!" But the cameras didn't pull away, their lenses hungrily capturing every move. Tom's face hardened, his fingers gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. For a moment, it seemed he might stay silent, that his patience would snap, and he'd simply walk away. But instead, he rose slowly, his movements deliberate, like a man who knew every action now carried weight. The audience fell silent, their eyes glued to him. A camera operator, forgetting his job, lowered his lens, but the director barked sharply and the shot snapped back. Tom stood tall and unyielding, his gaze piercing Jimmy like a spear. The host shifted, his smile trembling, but he held his facade, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. "Jimmy," Tom began, his voice low but resonating through the studio like a bell, "I've lived long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. But you've crossed a line. You're not just asking questions, you're throwing dirt, hoping something sticks. And for what? Ratings, clicks? Or just because you enjoy watching someone fall?" The audience burst into applause, but Tom raised a hand, and they fell silent instantly. His gaze never left Jimmy, who now sat hunched, his confidence melting away. "You want to talk about my career? Fine. I've spent 40 years telling stories that bring people together. Forrest Gump taught us to see beauty in simplicity. Saving Private Ryan showed what sacrifice means. Philadelphia made the world talk about AIDS when people were too scared to even say the word. And you dare say it's one hit? You dare dig through the filth conjured by sick minds and call it journalism?" Tom's voice grew stronger but never lost control. Each word was a precise, devastating blow. The audience listened, breathless, some wiping tears, others nodding, feeling his words resonate with their own struggles for dignity. Backstage, Tom's publicist pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with pride. In the control booth, producers scrambled, one whispering, "This is a disaster," or "a masterpiece." Tom stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, his posture commanding but not threatening. "You ask how I live with these insane theories? I'll tell you. I live by doing my work. I live by supporting my family, my friends, people who believe in something bigger than gossip. I live knowing the truth always outlasts lies, even if it takes time. And you? You live chasing sensationalism, tearing down those who've achieved more than you ever will. And I pity you, Jimmy. I really do." The words landed like a stone in water, rippling through the room. A woman in the front row sobbed. The man beside her stood and clapped, others following suit. The applause swelled until the studio shook with its force. Jimmy sat, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His notes lay crumpled on the desk, as if he'd been clutching them unconsciously. Tom turned to the audience, his gaze softening but still burning with passion. "I want to say to all of you," he said, his voice warm but resolute, "dignity is a choice. Respect is a choice. We live in a time when it's easy to throw mud, to accuse, to tear down. But I believe in better. I believe in people who fight for justice, for truth, for their voices to be heard. And I believe we're stronger than hate, stronger than lies, stronger than those who want to diminish us." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, as if speaking to each person individually. "My career isn't about awards or box office numbers. It's about stories that remind us who we are, And no one, not you, Jimmy, not anyone online, will take that from me. Because it's not just my legacy, it's the legacy of everyone who believes in something real. The audience exploded into cheers, people standing, clapping, shouting support. Cameras trembled, operators barely holding the shot, caught up in the moment. In the control booth, chaos reigned. One producer shouted about cutting to commercial, another held his head muttering, "We're done for." But no one dared interrupt. This wasn't just a moment. It was history unfolding live. Tom turned back to Jimmy, who sat with his head bowed, his confidence melted like wax. "I'm done," Tom said quietly, his voice cutting through the room. "I came here to talk about art, about hope, about what unites us. But you chose a different path, and that's your choice." He adjusted his jacket, his movements calm and dignified, and walked toward the edge of the stage. Before disappearing backstage, he paused, casting a final glance at the audience. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "You remind me why I do this." As the curtain fell behind him, the studio erupted. People shouted, clapped, some wept. A woman in the front row held up her phone, recording, her face glowing. Jimmy remained at his desk, his face a mask of shock. He tried to smile, mumbling something about a commercial break, but his voice shook, and no one listened. The cameras finally cut away, but it was too late. The world had seen everything. As soon as the broadcast ended, social media exploded. The hashtag #Team Tom shot to the top trend on X, followed closely by #Kimmel exposed and #Hank's legacy. Clips of Tom's speech spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views in hours. Users posted, "Tom Hanks just showed what true dignity looks like." Kimmel thought he'd catch a viral moment and got schooled instead. Memes of Jimmy's stunned face as Tom dismantled him flooded the internet. The media seized the story, with headlines screaming, "Tom Hanks destroys Jimmy Kimmel in live TV showdown." The Tonight Show clash, Hanks defends his legacy. Columnists dissected Tom's speech, calling it a masterclass in dignity and a call for respect in the clickbait era. Fans launched the hashtag #HanksForHope campaign, sharing favorite moments from his films that inspired them. For Jimmy, the fallout was devastating. The Tonight Show's ratings plummeted, advertisers voiced concerns, and online petitions demanding his resignation surfaced. Jimmy issued a statement, trying to deflect. "My job is to ask tough questions. I respect Tom and meant no offense." But the apology drowned in criticism, with users calling it empty and too late. Whispers in the industry suggested producers were considering a new host, and Jimmy's team worked around the clock to salvage his reputation. Meanwhile, Tom Hanks returned to work, refusing to comment on the incident. His silence only strengthened his stance. His speech had said it all. His new film shattered box office records, and polls showed his popularity soaring, especially among younger viewers who saw him as a symbol of resilience. On X, celebrities voiced support. Oprah Winfrey posted, "This was about respect. Thank you, Tom." And Steven Spielberg added, "He said what we all feel." The Tonight Show studio buzzed about that night for weeks. Camera operators recounted how their hands shook while filming Tom. Producers sighed, admitting they'd underestimated his strength. A Forrest Gump poster hung in the control booth with the caption, "Life is like a box of chocolates. Sometimes you get a lesson." Jimmy never joked about Tom again, and no one in the studio dared challenge him. Tom Hanks emerged from the battle not just a victor, but a symbol. A man who reminded the world that dignity and truth would always have the final word.